Calaroga Shark Media.
On the evening of March 12, 2013, 115 cardinals processed into the Sistine Chapel. Their voices joined in the ancient hymn, Veni Creator Spiritus. Above them, Michelangelo's imposing Last Judgment fresco seemed to underscore the gravity of their task. These men, representing 6 continents and countless cultures, faced an unprecedented situation. Selecting a successor to a pope who had not died, but resigned. The last such conclave had been held 600 years earlier, long before any modern nation existed. This is White Smoke, Episode 11. From the End of the World. After entering the chapel, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the senior cardinal present, administered the oath of secrecy. Each elector approached the Gospel book, placed his hand upon it, and swore to maintain absolute confidentiality about the proceedings and to vote according to his conscience. The master of papal liturgical celebrations then gave the traditional order, extra omnes, everyone out. The massive doors of the Sistine Chapel swung closed and were sealed from the outside. The conclave had officially begun. This conclave differed significantly from the one that had elected Benedict XVI 8 years earlier. Then, Joseph Ratzinger had been the clear frontrunner, securing election on just the 4th ballot. Now, no cardinal entered the Sistine Chapel with the same level of support. Vatican observers identified several papabili, papal contenders, but no obvious successor to Benedict. Cardinal Angelo Scola of Milan, a moderate theological conservative with administrative experience, was considered a strong Italian candidate. Cardinal Marc Ouellet of Canada, who headed the Congregation for Bishops, represented the possibility of a North American pope. Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana could become the first African pope since ancient times. And several Latin American cardinals, including Odilo Scherer of Brazil and Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, represented the Southern Hemisphere, where 2/3 of the world's Catholics now lived. This geographic consideration weighed heavily on many cardinal electors. As one Brazilian cardinal had noted during pre-conclave discussions, the Church has 4 cardinals from countries with fewer than 1 million Catholics, and only 2 from Brazil with its 130 million faithful. The numerical centre of Catholicism had shifted decisively to the global south, yet the Church's leadership remained predominantly European. Another crucial factor was governance reform. Benedict's resignation had occurred against a backdrop of scandals that suggested deep dysfunction in the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. The VatiLeaks scandal had exposed infighting, corruption, and resistance to financial transparency. Many cardinals from outside Rome had experienced frustration in dealing with curial departments that seemed more interested in protecting their turf than serving the global Church. "We need someone who can clean house," an American cardinal reportedly told colleagues. The next pope must reform the governance of the Church. This sentiment was echoed by cardinals from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who had long felt marginalized by the Italian-dominated Curia. The first ballot was held that evening, with black smoke emerging from the chapel chimney at 7:42 p.m, indicating no pope had been elected. This was expected. First ballots traditionally serve as a way for cardinals to signal their initial preferences before serious negotiations begin. Behind the sealed doors, a picture was emerging. According to later accounts from several cardinals, the initial vote split primarily among Scola, Ouellet, and Bergoglio, with the Argentine cardinal receiving a surprisingly strong showing. Bergoglio, who had reportedly been the runner-up to Ratzinger in 2005, had not been prominently mentioned in pre-conclave speculation. At 76, many assumed he was too old to be seriously considered. Jorge Mario Bergoglio presented a study in contrasts, the son of Italian immigrants to Argentina. He bridged the European and Latin American worlds. A Jesuit intellectual who had taught literature and psychology, he was known for his simple lifestyle, riding public transportation and living in a small apartment rather than the Archbishop's palace in Buenos Aires. He had served as provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina during the country's brutal military dictatorship in the 1970s, a period that had made him both politically savvy and controversial in his homeland. On the morning of March 13th, 2 more ballots were held, with black smoke again emerging at 11:38 a.m., but the voting patterns were shifting. Cardinal Scola's support had plateaued, while Bergoglio's continued to grow. During lunch at the Casa Santa Marta, where the cardinals were housed during the conclave, conversations intensified. Several cardinals from developing nations spoke about the symbolic importance of choosing a pope from the Southern Hemisphere. Cardinal Claudio Humes of Brazil, sitting beside Bergoglio, whispered supportive words to his friend as it became clear he was gaining momentum. Cardinal Christoph Schönborn of Vienna, once considered a papabile himself, reportedly began encouraging support for the Argentine. Even some of Scola's supporters, recognizing their candidate could not secure the necessary 2/3 majority, began considering Bergoglio as an alternative. By the 4th ballot that afternoon, a decisive shift occurred. Multiple accounts suggest Bergoglio crossed the threshold of 77 votes required for election. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the scrutineers confirmed the count, and Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re approached Bergoglio with the formal question: "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" After a brief moment of prayer, Bergoglio answered, "Accepto. I accept." When asked what name he would take as Pope, he chose Francis, in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the 13th century friar known for his humility and concern for the poor. It was a name no previous pope had chosen, signaling from the first moment his intent to take the church in a new direction. At 7:06 p.m, white smoke billowed from the Sistine Chapel chimney. In St. Peter's Square, where rain had been falling steadily throughout the day, the crowd erupted in cheers. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica began to ring, confirming that a new pope had been elected. People ran through the streets of Rome toward the Vatican, calling friends and family with the news. Remarkably, the conclave had concluded in just over 24 hours, one of the shortest in modern history. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the new pope was taken to the Room of Tears, where he donned the white papal vestments. Tradition holds that many newly elected popes weep here upon realizing the magnitude of their new office. According to Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, when presented with the traditional red mozzetta cape and ornate stole, Francis declined them, saying, "No thank you, Monsignore, you put them on instead. Carnival time is over." At 8:12 p.m, French Cardinal Jean-Louis Tauran appeared on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to make the traditional announcement. "Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam." I announce to you a great joy, we have a pope. When he pronounced Georgium Marium Bergoglio, confusion spread through the crowd. Like Karol Wojtyła 35 years earlier, this was a name unfamiliar to many in the square. "He has taken the name Franciscum," Tauran concluded. More surprise. No pope had ever chosen this name, despite St. Francis being one of Catholicism's most beloved figures. The crowd's anticipation grew as they waited for their first glimpse of the unknown Argentine, who was now the leader of the world's 1.2 billion Catholics. When Francis stepped onto the balcony, his appearance was striking in its simplicity. He wore only the white papal cassock, without the red cape or ornate stole his predecessors had used. He stood still for a long moment, gazing at the crowd in silence, an unusual beginning that captured the attention of everyone in the square and the estimated 1 billion people watching worldwide. "Brothers and sisters, good evening," he began, using the informal greeting of a parish priest rather than formal papal language. You know that the duty of the conclave was to give Rome a bishop. It seems that my brother cardinals have gone almost to the end of the world to find one." The crowd laughed and cheered at this self-deprecating reference to his Argentine origins. In another break with tradition, before giving the customary Urbi et Orbi blessing, Francis asked the crowd to pray for him. "I ask you to pray to the Lord to bless me, the prayer of the people for their bishop. Let us take a moment of silence, and you can offer your prayer for me." Then he bowed his head, and the square fell silent, an extraordinary moment of humility that immediately distinguished him from his predecessors. Only after receiving the prayers of the people did Francis impart his blessing. He then added another personal touch. "Tomorrow, I want to go to pray to the Madonna, that she may protect Rome." Before leaving the balcony, he offered a simple, "Good night and good rest" to the crowd, speaking as a pastor rather than a monarch. The impact of these first moments was immediate and profound. He won over Rome in 5 minutes, observed Vatican correspondent John Allen. The Italian newspaper La Repubblica declared on its front page, "The revolution of Pope Francis." Even before any formal pronouncements or policy changes, Francis had signalled through symbols and style that his papacy would be different. While the crowd in St. Peter's Square dispersed, speculation began about what the election of this particular cardinal might mean. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Bergoglio had been known for his focus on social justice, his criticism of economic inequality, and his personal austerity, choosing to live in a simple apartment rather than the Archbishop's palace and cooking his own meals. He had also established a reputation as a bridge builder who could work with people of diverse viewpoints. Despite holding traditional Catholic positions on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, he had criticized priests who refused to baptize children born out of wedlock and had washed the feet of AIDS patients when the disease carried significant stigma in Argentina. His election represented multiple firsts: the first pope from the Americas, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, the first Jesuit, and the first to take the name Francis. Each of these aspects suggested potential new directions for the Church. That evening, Francis declined to use the papal limousine, instead boarding a bus with the other cardinals to return to the Casa Santa Marta, the Vatican guesthouse where they had stayed during the conclave. "I'll just go with the guys on the bus," he reportedly said. Later that night, he called the main Jesuit residence in Rome to explain his choice of name, telling the Father General, "I didn't have the courage to call myself Ignatius. It seemed too much to identify with the founder of the Jesuits. So I thought of Francis of Assisi, the man of poverty, peace and care for creation." The next morning provided more indications of Francis's approach. He left the Vatican without a formal security detail to pray at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, stopping first to collect his luggage and pay his bill at the clergy residence where he had stayed before the conclave. He gave an example of priestly behaviour, said Father Pavel Ritel Andrianic, who witnessed the new pope insisting on paying his own way. In the hours following his election, messages of congratulation poured in from world leaders and religious figures. Argentine President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who had clashed with Bergoglio over social policies, set aside political differences to celebrate a historic moment for Argentina. US President Barack Obama welcomed Francis's commitment to the least of these. Eastern Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew announced he would attend Francis's installation mass, the first time since the Great Schism of 1054 that the Orthodox leader would attend a papal installation. At the Casa Santa Marta, Francis made another significant decision. Rather than moving into the papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace, he would continue to reside in the guesthouse. This choice, initially described as temporary, would become permanent, a rejection of the isolation that had traditionally surrounded popes. The papal apartment, with its multiple reception rooms and staff of several dozen, represented a level of grandeur at odds with Francis's vision of church leadership. He said he was doing this because he needs to live with people, explained Vatican spokesman Father Federico Lombardi. He made a choice to maintain a certain simplicity in his life. This decision had practical implications for Vatican operations. Francis would take his meals in the communal dining room, celebrating morning mass with Vatican employees and visitors, and maintaining a less formal daily schedule than his predecessors. As details about the conclave voting emerged through anonymous accounts, it became clear that Francis represented a compromise between different factions. He appealed to traditionalists through his doctrinal orthodoxy and personal piety, while progressives appreciated his emphasis on social justice and simple lifestyle. Cardinals from developing nations saw him as representing the global shift in Catholicism, while Europeans recognized his Italian cultural heritage. His election also reflected the Cardinals' assessment of the Church's most pressing challenges. By selecting a pope known for administrative reform in his diocese, they signalled a desire to address the governance problems that had plagued Benedict's papacy. By choosing someone with a strong social justice focus, they acknowledged the growing importance of economic inequality as a moral issue. And by selecting a pope from Latin America, they recognized the demographic reality of a church increasingly centered in the global south. At his first press conference on March 16th, Francis explained his choice of name in more detail, describing how during the conclave, his friend Cardinal Hummes had embraced him as the votes for Bergoglio mounted. "Don't forget the poor," Hummes had whispered. "And that word entered here," Francis said, pointing to his heart. "The poor, the poor." Then immediately in relation to the poor, I thought of Francis of Assisi. Then I thought of wars. And Francis is the man of peace. And thus, the name came to my heart, Francis of Assisi. He concluded this explanation with words that would become emblematic of his papacy. "How I would like a church that is poor and for the poor." This theme, a church defined not by its institutional power, but by its service to the marginalized, would emerge as central to Francis's pontificate. Francis's formal installation mass on March 19th, the feast of St. Joseph, reflected his preference for simplicity. The ceremony was shorter than those of his predecessors, with fewer elaborate rituals. He received the fisherman's ring and pallium, symbols of papal authority, but the ring was gold-plated silver rather than the solid gold used by previous popes. In his homily, Francis emphasized protection of the environment, of the vulnerable, of human dignity. "Let us not forget that hatred, envy, and pride defile our lives," he said. Being protectors, then, also means keeping watch over our emotions, over our hearts. He delivered these words in Italian rather than Latin, another signal of his preference for accessibility over formality. The installation was attended by representatives from 132 governments and international organizations, including Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, making it the largest gathering of different Christian denominations at a papal installation in history. This ecumenical dimension reflected Francis's reputation for interfaith dialogue in Argentina, where he had maintained close relationships with Jewish and Muslim leaders. As the new pope settled into his role, attention turned to what his election might mean for a church facing significant challenges. From the ongoing clergy sex abuse crisis, to declining religious practice in traditional Catholic regions, to internal governance issues, Vatican observers noted Francis's emphasis on the church as a field hospital after battle, focused on healing wounds rather than enforcing rules. In the days following his election, stories emerged from Argentina illustrating his character. Parishioners described how as archbishop, he would ride public buses, visit slums, and cook for himself. A shoe shiner recalled Bergoglio stopping for regular shines while discussing soccer and family life. These anecdotes, quickly spreading through global media, created an image of an approachable, humble pope in contrast to the more formal style of his immediate predecessors. This narrative of humility and simplicity resonated even with non-Catholics and the secular media. Time magazine noted, Francis's humility was immediately apparent. The New York Times described him as a doctrinal conservative who emphasizes care for the poor and marginalized. Even publications generally critical of the Catholic Church found aspects of Francis to praise, particularly his rejection of papal luxury. For the Catholic faithful, Francis's election represented different things to different groups. Conservative Catholics appreciated his theological orthodoxy and personal piety. Progressive Catholics welcomed his focus on economic justice and environmental concerns. Catholics in developing nations celebrated having a pope who understood their realities firsthand. And for the massive Latin American Catholic population, his election was a historic acknowledgement of their importance to the Church's future. Meanwhile, at Castel Gandolfo, Pope Emeritus Benedict followed news of his successor with interest. Though he had promised not to interfere, his very existence created an unprecedented situation. Francis addressed this directly, speaking of Benedict with warmth and respect. On March 23rd, in another break with precedent, Francis travelled to Castel Gandolfo to meet with his predecessor, the first time in history that a pope and former pope had met face to face. The two men, one from Argentina, one from Germany, one a Jesuit, the other a Benedictine-influenced diocesan priest, one emphasizing pastoral flexibility, the other doctrinal clarity, prayed together and spoke privately. Vatican observers scrutinized the few released photos for clues about their relationship. The image of two men dressed in papal white, one elected after the other's resignation, represented a new chapter in the Church's long history. Witnesses reported that Francis insisted, "We are brothers," and declined to kneel on the provided prie-dieu during their joint prayer, instead asking Benedict to join him in the same chair. This gesture of equality, while respecting Benedict's contribution, subtly indicated Francis's determination to follow his own path, rather than simply continuing his predecessor's agenda. Within weeks of his election, Francis had established a distinctive papal style that emphasized accessibility, simplicity, and concern for the marginalized. He made personal phone calls to ordinary people who had written to him. He celebrated his morning mass with Vatican gardeners, cleaners, and office workers. He washed the feet of juvenile detainees, including women and Muslims, on Holy Thursday, breaking with the tradition of washing only the feet of male priests. Each of these actions represented not just personal style, but a particular vision of the Church, one less concerned with maintaining hierarchical distinctions and more focused on direct encounter with people on the peripheries. This vision was encapsulated in his frequent critique of self-referential church leaders who live within themselves, of themselves, for themselves. The selection of the name Francis had proven prescient. Like his 13th century namesake, who was told by Christ to rebuild my church, the new pope seemed intent on renewal through radical simplicity and concern for the marginalized, rather than through institutional reform alone. The humble friar who had embraced lepers and preached to birds offered a model of spiritual leadership focused on witness rather than power. For a church accustomed to measured evolution rather than sharp transitions, the election of Pope Francis represented a significant shift in tone and emphasis, if not in fundamental doctrine. The cardinals who entered the Sistine Chapel on March 12th had chosen not just a new leader, but a new direction, one that acknowledged the global nature of contemporary Catholicism and the need for a church that engaged directly with the modern world's most pressing challenges. In an institution that thinks in centuries, the first weeks of a papacy offer only hints of its ultimate historical significance. But as Francis settled into his role as the 266th successor to St. Peter, one thing was clear: the cardinals had gone almost to the end of the world and found a pope determined to bring the Church's focus back to its beginnings, to the simplicity, humility, and concern for the poor that had characterized its founder. Every papal transition writes a new chapter in the Church's history. The election of Francis wrote one of its most surprising. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.